9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn.
Borida Pab Croeso Abitawi. Welcome to the Twilight Show. Tonight we are talking about equity in education. The book, a practical guide for teachers levelling the playing field of learning. It's helping teachers improve the prospects of under-resourced and working class pupils. We're joined by the author Lee Elliott Major. Tune in, talk it out. Off we go.
Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And as I say, Borida Pab Croeso Abitawi. Hello everyone, welcome to Swansea, welcome to the Twilight Show. It is not Twilight. That time of year when it's been, I think Twilight was, approximately about 3 o'clock today here in Swansea. But it is the Twilight Show, and we are talking about equity in education. This wonderful book, A Practical Guide for Teachers, Levelling the Playing Field of Learning, with Lee Elliott Major, who should have joined us on the line. Lee, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
You are. Maybe just a little bit closer to the microphone if you can.
Yep. Is that better?
Yep, that's fabulous. And we'll work from there. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. Thank you for joining us.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I've heard a lot of your shows over the years, so it's great to be featured.
Fantastic. Well, as I say, I don't know if you heard, really enjoyed the book. I've read through it. I should say, listeners, I'm not going to hold back here. I had a digital copy of the book. I enjoyed it. I bought a hard copy so that I could hand it to people in the staff room and say, look, here is the, read this. So I am sat here with the book in front of me, and I really want to pick your brain. So we'll dip a little bit into the book. We'll dip a little bit kind of into your brains, as it were, then as well, kind of just pulling apart those thoughts. But of course, if you are listening to us, we're live, and you can reach out to us. You can message us on Twitter, or X as it's now called, at TT Radio Official, or of course, if you're listening live in the Podbean app, you can type your questions straight into the chat there, and you can join the conversation. Now, I think just to get ourselves sort of started, Lee, why don't you kind of explain a little bit about yourself and what you currently do?
So this sort of, the idea of helping children from under-resourced backgrounds, we might come back to that point about language, is something that I've been interested in all my life. I'm myself someone who comes from a background where no one in my family had been, into higher education. I lived on my own from 15. I've got various stories of my life. My friends always say it seems to get bigger every time I tell the story of my upbringing. But I guess if you looked at me at age 15, all the stats that we look at, you'd probably have said this kid's not going to get on in life, however we define that. And, it was other people that helped me out. It was teachers that helped me, an uncle in my family, that gave me a bit of support. Of course, higher education in those days, you got a full maintenance grant, of course, if you came from a background, sort of low income background. So, there's a personal dimension to this. So I got back into the education system and ended up, of course, doing a PhD and done lots of other things since then. And so it's a personal thing. But then I was a Guardian journalist for quite a few years. I'm 55 now. I've done quite a few different things. Had a career in that when the Guardian was a big newspaper. I don't know if listeners remember when there was these big education supplements. Don't exist anymore, of course. And then I worked for a thing called the Sutton Trust, which many listeners will know of, which is a sort of charity committed to improving social mobility through education, eventually becoming chief exec. And then 5 years ago, or nearly 5 years ago, I became the country's first professor of social mobility. And I guess, my sort of whole, and I'm involved in practical projects. I'm a professor of practice, so I'm involved in practical projects as well as research. But the whole rationale is, you know, people's background should determine what they do, whatever they go on to do in life, right? So I always tell the story when I do my lectures of I was Daily Mail, right? I featured in the Daily Mail, and they did this story of me as the bin man turned professor. And it is true, I was a bin man and indeed a street cleaner. But what the story doesn't tell was that it was actually nepotism. My mum worked for the local council. It was a summer job, a very good summer job, actually. And the reason I tell that story is implicitly when you see those media headlines, bin man turned professor, the sort of American dream sort of style narrative, it implicitly judges people that do have different jobs. In this case, bin men, and I think, when I do sessions with primary school pupils, it's always lovely because we get into discussions about what we value in terms of jobs, right? So even though I suppose I'm a classic story of social mobility in that first wave, if you like, I think I've come round to thinking this book, Equity in Education, really summarises a lot of my reflections on these narratives. Is that I don't think it's enough for us to focus on a few people that manage to sort of climb the social ladder. What we want is a system that's genuinely inclusive. So people like you and me keep our accents, although my accent's gone a bit, and we don't feel like we're imposters. We are able to flourish in a system, in a classroom, or in a workplace that genuinely values people from different backgrounds. I still don't think we have that. I think we've got a very narrow sort of perspective still, what I call the deficit mindset, which we'll probably get into. But anyway, sorry, that's a long introduction, but that's my history, and that's why I'm so passionate about this topic. Hello, you still there?
Sorry, yeah, very useful and lots to unpick there. And I should say as well, a very cool young person as well. And I would advise people, not in that newspaper article you mentioned, but in another one, there is I did manage to find a photo of you as a youngster, incredibly cool looking young person, I should say. I think it was in an independent piece showing you, I think possibly in your late teens or early 20s, looking incredibly cool as a young person in London.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. But I think there's a big point here about we might get onto this. When we speak about cultural capital in schools, there tends to be that Govian Michael Gove tendency to think of that only in middle class values. So we tend to think of the importance of museums for everyone, going to the theatre. I have my own cultural capital, as you say. Well, I like the term "cool." There, kids probably wouldn't even understand that term now, right?
Yeah.
But I bring my own cultural experiences, and in my view, they're just as valid. The fact that I was into clubbing and playing guitar and all that stuff, it's just as valid as someone who plays a classical instrument or something. And I think still we fall into those traps of judging those people from different backgrounds. So yeah, it's a very personal mission for me, and I think it's probably quite an obsession in many ways. But what's been lovely for me is since we published the book, is it really seems to have struck a chord, if I could use that musical analogy, with many teachers. I think teacher leaders, of course, some of them will be of my age, so they do, I think, resonate with some of my experiences, because a lot of teachers, of course, come from working class backgrounds, but like me, have made that sort of trajectory, I suppose, into middle class life. By definition, if you're a professor or you're a teacher, you have become middle class. But we might come back into that.
No, you're a really interesting point, and I think because I know, or it's hard to judge what is working class, and where these boundaries lie. I think are really difficult for people, and an example of that is before the show I did put out a kind of this is only a Twitter survey, but I did put out, just a poll, just asking teachers, and it might be self-selecting because, I follow people who are teachers who have similar, all of those things. I'll caveat it with that. But it was about 50% of teachers came back saying they considered that they grew up working class, which surprised me, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, I suspect that is a bit of a self-selecting sample, because all the studies that have looked into this suggest that there is a majority that do come from more middle class backgrounds. Um, but there will be many that come from working class backgrounds who then by definition have become middle class, like me. So you're either you've got people who, and many of them will be like me, awkward climbers, who still feel a bit like, where are we? We came from a certain background, we've ended up slightly still not knowing where we are in some ways. But we could have a whole podcast on class, of course, and in the book we sort of try and define what we mean by that. Class, by the way, Nathan, it evolves. It's always there. So those very old notions of working, middle, and upper class probably don't apply in the same way as they did back then. But in my view, it is still there, right? And the reason we talk about social class in the book a lot is divides in society aren't just about material money, even though they are important. They're also about our cultural assumptions. And that's really important to recognize and acknowledge as a teaching profession, and indeed as academics, because that informs the way that we teach. The other thing about class is really interesting in this country is that many middle class people claim to be working class when they're clearly not, right? So this is replicated in all the surveys. The British Social Attitude Survey shows this every time it's done. And I think people sort of relate to being working class, and often it's about their parents and it's about their history. But on all sorts of measures, they are quintessential middle class, right? But they still, and this is a British phenomenon, by the way. You don't get it in other countries. So there's something quite interesting going on there with class, isn't there? But I'm sure we'll talk about this as we go with this.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpick, and there's like a lot of different things. I do find it so fascinating, sort of talking through those different elements. And I do want to ask you, when we get onto some of the different parts, particularly about how we can help teachers, about how that can work when maybe you haven't grown up experiencing the same things. I just want to go back to the book, just to give a sort of run through, because, we will, if you are listening, try and hit some of these key themes within the book. But the book's divided into 4 sections, and those are section 1, which sets out kind of the overall arguments and considerations of work in schools and their social, their societal and political context. There's section 2, which is advice for practitioners in the classroom. Section 3, which is for the kind of teacher leaders you mentioned there, the head teachers, heads of department, and what they could be thinking about. And then section 4 as well, which is about national policy in England and the UK and also abroad. And so we've got quite the book covers a lot of things there. But I wanted to get into, and I've realised I haven't really primed you for this question. I looking at the cover of the book, this has jumped out at me, which is, this aspect of equity. And if I could describe the front cover, it might be that some teachers are familiar with the image on the front cover of this difference between equality and equity.
Yeah, so these words, we honestly, I had many sleepless nights as we were going to deadline on these words. We purposely use that word equity rather than equality. In our view, and if you look at all the evidence on this, we live in really an unequal world, right? It's become more unequal. And for many young children and young people, it's no fault of their own, right? So that they happen to have grown up in a place where, they faced issues around eating, food, having food, having sleep, all the basic entitlements that perhaps in previous generations we took for granted have been eroded in some ways. So, I would argue that we are living in more unequal times. And sadly, I suspect that's going to be the case for at least another decade, I suspect. So we've gone backwards, in many ways as a society. So I believe, and this is quite controversial in some cases, I think, I believe we should devote more time and resource to children from under-resourced backgrounds. Again, we might come back down to that term. By the way, for listeners, so I've used the term disadvantaged people all through my professional life. I'm now using the term children from under-resourced backgrounds, because as soon as you use that term, disadvantaged people, you fall into deficit mindset. You start to implicitly, unconsciously label that child as someone who's somehow inferior that we've got to change. Okay, so language is really important in all this. But equity, that word equity, we believe it's sort of part of that equity is fairness, right? It's about, in my view, leveling that playing field or learning field or whatever, however you want to phrase it. And the countries that do really well on this, you mentioned in the book, we do a bit of an international review on this. And I think we're falling behind as a country, by the way, in the way that we hold schools to account. We've got a very narrow inspection performance sort of accountability system, which with what other countries are doing now. But what we need to think about as a school system is focusing on giving more resource to those children who need it the most. And so when you look at nations like the Scandinavian nations, for example, and they're very different, they're more equal than us, they're smaller than us, there's all sorts of caveats to these international comparisons. But what they do is they focus on equity first, and excellence comes from that, right? So if you do well for children from under-resourced backgrounds, in my view, all your children will flourish. We get it the wrong way round, I think. If you hear politicians, they talk about excellence, they have these sort of very narrow views, in my view, of what that means. And we have a system that's failed, basically. If you look at any statistics that me and others do on the gaps that still persist, for all the rhetoric and for all the work we do, we are still facing huge divides. And as you all know, I'm sure, many children are not coming to school as often as they should do now. We are facing a retention and recruitment crisis in teaching. I hate to press all your listeners, but I think the time has come to review the fundamentals of our education system so that it's fit for all, so it's inclusive for all, and equity is a key part of that.
And I'm going to push you on a couple of bits there, and this is things that I hear, and as I say, I work in a challenging catchment with as you say, under-resourced, struggling at times young people, but it's often said. I'm thinking how best to phrase this. You mentioned the American dream. We talk often about meritocracies, and we paint this picture of, if you work hard, you'll do well. This individualism of it, and sometimes, and some teachers, and certainly people who I meet in the community will question me on, why we are giving more to people who maybe they perceive as not deserving of it, or there's a kind of moral weight to it of, a kind of negativity of because you somehow deserved that. Does that make sense? What is there then in all of this evidence an argument against that individualism of the American dream, or that doesn't work for us as a country?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been fascinated by for many years, because in the studies of social mobility, we look at different countries, we look at different places in different countries. Where are the more mobile countries, places? And by the way, people are interested in that concept of social mobility. That measures the likelihood of you changing social class or income compared with your parents. And the more mobile a society, the more it suggests that there's more equality of opportunity, right? So what we find in those international comparisons is really interesting. It's the Scandinavian nations, it's Australia, Canada, who do better than places like the United States, United Kingdom. Ironically, United States, of course, home of the American dream. So it's the countries that appear to embrace more collective culture. So, if you go to Scandinavia, and I do lots of presentations to school leaders in the Scandinavian countries, always fascinating because they actually are struggling with some of the issues we're struggling with increasingly as their societies become more diverse. But what's really interesting to me when I go and present over there, you can taste it in the culture there. They're far more gender, by the way, equality. You can really see that, which I think we're still years behind on that. But they also have this real almost obsession about not being individualistic, so even being called number one causes real anxiety in some of the meetings that I've done with teachers over there. It's fascinating to me. So the countries that do really well on social mobility, on the idea that your background should determine what happens to you in life, are those, in my view, that have a more collective notion of success. And I get really frustrated with this, David, because when I do my own life story, it's another thing that I explore with the pupils and sometimes trainee teachers when I do sessions with them. My life is another example of this. It was other people that helped me, so I'm deeply suspicious of people that say my success is all down to my individual talent. Usually, for 99.99% of us, it usually is that people have helped us at key transitions in our lives. Certainly happened for me. And I think that's something, actually, as we all must remember in these debates. And of course, teachers do this all the time. But if you can help someone in a key point in their lives, right, to get them through that transition, to help them think about the choices, it might be sixth form choices, it might be apprenticeship versus university. These are the key things that you can do actually as an adult is help them out. And everyone, apart from a few geniuses, perhaps, we are all the products of some collective, grounding, if you like. And so it's really important this, and I talk about it a lot because these values are so important, and I feel like we've bought into the American dream version, if you like, of society. And I would go as far to say that modern capitalism, is getting big. It's important though because the context of schools is this: the modern capitalist, neoliberal sort of, system is, in my view, broken. That promise, the promise that anyone can do well, the idea that anyone can get a roof over their head and pay and have a decent life, that has gone. And I think there's going to be some really interesting political debates over the next decades on this. I mention all this because it's important for schools, because what all the politicians do is say, we're going to allow inequality to rise as long as we have some sort of social mobility. But by the way, the job of ensuring equality of opportunity comes down to schools. We're not going to pay them much to do this, but it's their responsibility. And if it doesn't happen, we're going to blame teachers for it, right? And we're going to create an accountability system that basically assumes that schools can solve all of society's ills. And that's why I think where we are at the moment, that's why I think we're having so many problems. So a lot of the stuff that I do, of course, and we'll talk about some of the practical tips for individual teachers and teacher leaders, are really important. But there are these more systematic debates I think we need to have. And to be frank, I think we should get on the front foot more as a profession and say, look, here's the evidence. We've got people like Lee, producers, these politicians. You've got to be a bit more realistic about what schools can achieve, or you've got to fund them at rates that would enable them to address some of the things that you want them to address.
I'm just reading through my notes because we are skirting all over topics at the moment, and it's as I say, it's a complex but incredibly interesting thing, very well structured in the book as it takes us through. And I just wanted to pull on one thread there, just as while we're talking about sort of different countries, but also the complexity of this. You talk about where the possibly the blame gets attributed, or where the expectation on the work gets attributed. There's a part in the introduction that talks about sort of these polarized debates, and it mentions New York City Schools Chancellor Joel Klein saying, "You'll never fix poverty in America until you fix education in America," and the counter argument back that you'll never fix education in America until you fix poverty in America. And this kind of polarization of how we deal with the problems with teachers, unfortunately, at the moment, I do feel myself in the middle of this. Do you think we are similar in the UK at the moment, where there is a divide? Because I hear things about social mobility where it's kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but I also hear the other sides where possibly I sit more, which is we need to help, we need to restructure, we need to put in the support. Are we divided on this?
I think one of the fears I have with all these debates is we fall into false dichotomies in education. So that quote I had from Joel Klein in the New York schools debate, probably 20 years ago, and it's replicated here over this country since really the Michael Gove reforms, but also some of the New Labour reforms of the late 90s. And there are people that would say, as Klein was saying, we won't solve poverty until we solve education, right? I think it's a combination of the two things, right? You've got to, in my view, address the profound inequalities in society. So, for example, I would say that we need an early years system, and thankfully the politicians seem to be coming back round to this after decimating the early years support we have. In the late 90s, under New Labour, there was the creation of things called Sure Start centres, right? Children's centres. We were ahead of the world in terms of that early year support in many ways. It wasn't perfect. We then had the austerity era where all that infrastructure, all that effort was decimated, right? It fell apart. And now, 25 years later, we're now having the debates again. It's so frustrating. Schools are in catch up from day one, because if you look at the statistics, it's about 18 months development difference between someone from again, under-resourced background compared to someone from a more privileged background at age 5, right? So already you've got these huge divides. And so I think it's completely unfair to then say to the school system, you are going to address these divides. Because remember, even at age 5, children have already developed considerably. We also know, by the way, that 2 graduates with exactly the same grades from exactly the same university, the same degree, the one from a more privileged background will earn more in the workplace. They will progress faster in the workplace. There is something else going on, right, post the education system. And I do, some of my work is about challenging employers, about getting some of the social class biases and barriers within the workplace. So schools can't do it on their own. Universities can't do it on their own. That is absolutely crystal clear. But I think this is a false dichotomy, because for me, we can up our game. And the book, in a sense, is 2 arguments. It's one, let's create a fairer system for schools that actually measures them in a way that's realistic. But secondly, as a school system, as teachers, as a profession, let's up our game, because my view is we are creating some inside barriers inadvertently that we could address. So we've got to up our game, but we've got to also address some of those inequalities outside school gates as well.
In the book, as you say,
these are long answers, aren't they?
Incredibly interesting though, and I can see people sort of commenting in. I will try and get to them. Maxine there said, such a good point. Love the book. I see we've got Mr. Shu in as well. If you are listening live, send those questions in. Share your thoughts, because it is an incredibly interesting, as I say, and rich topic. Now, but the book you're advocating for, as you say, this kind of equity-based education, and you base it on 4 principles. And I wonder if you can just explain a little about what those 4 principles are that you see would help the under-resourced and working-class pupils we've been talking about.
So, as you say, there's 4 principles, and I guess we've covered a couple of those already. It's equity, not equality. So that's doing more for the children that need it most. And by the way, there's other evidence that shows that teachers can have more impact on young children, young people, because there's so much more untapped potential, if you like. So there's equity, not equality. And then we talk about capacity, not deficit mindset, and we might get into that in more detail. But that's starting to reflect on our own cultural norms in classrooms. There's a lot of things we do that aren't made explicit for those children who aren't developed in that way in the household. So there's lots of research over the years, a lot of sociological research around the differences in the way that children are developed in the home environment. And those from middle-class backgrounds, on average, just are much better prepared to advocate for themselves in the classroom. Interestingly, there's some research around, again, you've got to be really careful with these generalizations, but there is an individualism associated with some of those middle-class norms. It's self, it's advocating for the self, whereas in some working class cultures, there is more of an interdependency. So you're used to working together in more ways. And so there's a critique, actually, of some of our classroom practices in that we tend to, in some cases, accentuate the individual in the class, right? And if you think about the classroom, it's quite an unusual environment in many ways, So I think challenging some of those cultural norms, but also if we're not going to change them, at least being explicit so that every child understands them. So that's really thinking about capacity rather than deficit mindset. And a part of that is celebrating the achievements, the cultural achievements of those from working class backgrounds. We don't do enough of that in the classroom. It's an incredibly alienating system, to be honest, if you're not from a particular middle class type background, I would argue. And then the 3rd and 4th principles are important, and one of them is treating every child as an individual, a unique individual. We cite a lot of research around the fact that, of course, children, it's not just about social class, it's about their gender, it's about their ethnicity, it's also about their additional needs, perhaps, where they're born, if they're summer born. There's so many factors that shape the learning of those children. The universal challenge for teachers, of course, is that what you'd want to do is individualized feedback, modeling for each of those pupils in the classroom, alongside group activities. Of course, teachers never have the time to do that, but we discussed that idea of delivering individualized feedback in the classroom. I'm obsessed with that notion, by the way. That goes all the way to my days developing the Education Endowment Foundation toolkit, the Sutton Trust sort of toolkit where we reviewed all the research with my great friend Steve Higgins, a professor at Durham, and we recreated that guide, which has now become a sort of worldwide sort of popular guide. It's a review of research and best bets for teachers. The thing that came up really highly in that, in terms of most effective practices, was effective feedback, right? We all know this as teachers. It's hard to do. And one of the other reasons why we talk about individualized feedback is, again, trying to be very conscious of some of the stereotyping and labeling that does happen in schools. And because we have a system, we have this sort of false system of a pupil premium child or a free school meals child versus a non-pupil premium child, right? It makes us sort of subconsciously, I feel, that we see children as almost this sort of binary divide, right? When actually the reality is there's a continuum of disadvantage, of course, in that classroom. So individualized sort of feedback, treating children as unique learners. I know it sounds obvious, but it's something that's really important. And then finally, it's celebrating all forms of human talent. We have a system that really accentuates that ability to memorize facts and to analyze in a very sort of academic way the material. It's not all that, but it's really weighted heavily to that. And of course, we all know as adults that the things that enable people to get on in life is other things as well as that, creativity, practical skills, life skills, social emotional skills. So other countries are really thinking about this in how they value children. And by the way, things like well-being is now being looked at increasingly in other school systems. What is the well-being of the children and indeed the teachers in those schools? So a much broader, if you like, conceptualization of what we mean by human talent. But those are the four principles that we articulate in the book.
And I do want to, after the news in the second half of the show, I want to kind of get into the kind of specifics about what teachers can do, what schools as organisations can do, and all of those bits and pieces. But I'm really interested at the moment about that kind of, as you talk about some of those things, particularly around the sort of this capacity deficit mindset that we might have fallen in. And I find it, your descriptions of, using this term under-resourced rather than disadvantaged, and the way we potentially look at the system that we're in, the middle class system. I know in the book it talks about things like explaining the rules of the game, for want of a better word, explicitly to some of our young people, but we are talking sometimes about what is a middle class game, and I wondered your thoughts, within that on, and I will describe my realization somewhat in a previous role where we put together a list of things, and this was at a primary school level, where of things we wanted all our young people to have, and I sat back and looked at this list of things, and some of them were across the board, but some of them I realised we'd essentially got together and written a list of middle class childhood, for want of a better word, and that's what we'd come up with as cultural capital. And how does that fit into then this equity model of not looking at working classness as lesser?
I think this is so fundamental, to the issues. I suppose what I'm realizing with this book, it is a reflection of my own career, in the sense, because I've been involved in so many programs and government initiatives and working with schools over many years. And I think for me, it's the realization that it's actually the fundamentals that we've got to look at, right? It's the fact that we value, as you're saying, a particular part of society, and implicitly saying that's superior to everything else. And I just really challenge that assumption. I do think there are things around what we might think of as middle class culture that are important, and that do get people on in life. So we've got to make those things explicit, more explicit. But we've got to do it in a neutral way, right? We've got to say to those from more working class backgrounds or under-resourced backgrounds, we know you come with different cultural traditions, right? If you want to get on in, I don't know, the banking sector or the corporate sector or whatever it is, then here are the things you're going to have to do, right? Now you can choose what you want to do, because actually you might have to leave the community you're from to make it in those industries, right? So you're going to pay a penalty for it, but you might get a few more earnings. You might be pulled away from your local community, right? It's not all a positive, but here is your choice. And again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier. For me, my work is all around making sure that young people choose what they do, right? And that is irrespective of their background. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should all aspire to being famous or rich or whatever it is. And certainly loads of studies would suggest that is not the secret of happiness, right? Although it's really key, I think, here, because we've got such an unequal society, to say that everyone needs a certain amount of resource, right, to live by. And I think that's being eroded. I think that's a different issue. But coming back to your core point, I mean, one of the other projects I'm involved in, I think this really reflects this sort of, it is subtle and nuanced, these discussions, right? I'm doing a bit of work with civil servants at the moment. We're doing a sort of guide for the working class civil servant for the civil service is a very middle class culture. And one of the young female civil servants, really interesting, we did a chapter called The Art of Exaggeration. Okay. And what she was saying was that, so she's from a sort of working class background, and there was also a gender thing going on here as well. She'd shared an internal job application with her more middle class colleagues, and they all said to her, "Look, you're not winging it enough. You're not exaggerating what you've done enough to get this promotion." And she'd just literally documented what she'd done, right? You know, and what was interesting for her was because there was the official rules of the civil service. You apply, you do your application, but then there's the unwritten. It's often called the unwritten curriculum. The unwritten rules, and all these other more middle class people had all developed this art of exaggeration, and it is a real skill. And the Etonians, of course, do this better than anyone, right? So you've got to exaggerate to a point. If you exaggerate too much, of course, then people don't believe you, right? You do it often in a self-deprecating way, but you do advocate for yourself. There's a real art to it. And that, for me, is an example in the workplace of what I'm talking about. But it also is the case in education. So if you observe classrooms, there are those young children who will already be grounded in those sort of the art of advocacy, of exaggeration, all these stuff. And it just means you do better in the environments that we've created. So I think there's within these debates there's a dilemma, right? So for those civil servants, what we were saying was, look, to what extent should we challenge the system so that so for example, accents is an issue with the civil servant. The perception is, if you have a certain accent, you are likely to get on better than if you have a more regional accent, right? So the question there is, to what extent do you try and challenge that system, or do you modify your own accent to get on in the current system as it is? And that's one of the real dilemmas in these debates. So, what I'm doing at the moment with my book, and I've been presenting to trusts across the country. It's amazing, actually, the response to this. It really seems to have struck a chord. And what I'm saying is that I've got some initial ideas around what we should do to address some of these issues. But what I'm getting from teachers, and its leaders, its classroom teachers, is really, really interesting reflections on this. And I'm hoping over the next 6 months, a year, that we can develop some toolkits for classroom teachers to think about, to reflect on these things. But we'll probably come to this. What are the practical responses to some of these things that we know persist in our system?
No, I find that so interesting. Particularly when you talk about, the understanding things from a different point of view, accents particularly, which is something that I do get fixated on. Interestingly, my dad was more Welsh, from Wales. It doesn't have an accent. Lost it, deliberately. But one of the things I find, I grew up in a town that was very clearly divided. I grew up in Cambridge, where it is town and gown. And I was the town, and we used to look across to, the Etonians in the gown. And my sister still does make fun of me that when I go to interview, I dress in my version of what a more wealthy person does, and I look like I should be on the punts. And she now calls me Scudamores, which is one of the punting companies, because I'm wearing chinos and a blue shirt, because that's what I've seen as the kind of typical, that's how you get along, and you dress in a certain way and you look it. And I've somehow adopted these rules. But my question is then, is that the problem? Are we perpetuating the model then by losing my dad losing his accent, or myself losing my sense of dress to dress more like someone punting on the River Cam in Cambridge? Am I perpetuating the problem there?
Yeah, and these are the fascinating debates that I'm having at the moment. I've lost my accent. I was from West. I had some when I went to Sheffield University people would call me a Cockney, even though that was not quite true. Even though I'm a West Ham fan, actually, but I did have a real twang. You could tell I was from London. That's gone. I've and I don't think I've done it consciously. Sometimes when I give talks, people say they're very sad that I've lost my accent. I think a lot of us who I'd call awkward climbers have done that because it's probably we're trying to fit into the system that we have come into. And I can tell you, if there's one middle class profession that's even more middle class than teachers, it's professors. I can tell you that for sure. So I do think we all try and fit in with the system. And dress codes, it's really interesting you say that. So when I do my talks to trusts around the country, and indeed in other countries, but particularly in England, I would say, and to some extent the UK, there's a bit of a sort of corporate thing going on. So if you meet the senior CEO, and even the terminology now of trusts, actually, it's sort of bought into that sort of more corporate sort of culture, if you like. And there was the day when, if you look back at the old pictures of teachers in the 60s and 70s, there was definitely a more alternative look to some of those teachers. But then I think you've got to get the balance right here, right? I think you've got to be smart. You've got to turn up on time. All the things that might be associated perhaps with more middle class cultures. I think there are some things we can all benefit from, right? So I think there are things that I would say are good, but it's really nuanced this, and I, as a professor now, I think when I do my talks at schools, I sometimes think, well, okay, what am I going to wear? Should I replicate the suit? I used to wear suits. I don't anymore. Interestingly, I've sort of, I've almost like said, okay, I'm now a 55-year-old professor. I've just got to just go with who I am a bit more. But it's taken a lifetime for me to do that, right? If you're in a younger, I think if I was in my younger career phase, to be honest, I would probably be wearing a suit because I think that's what you need to do. So I think there is some interesting stuff about ties, by the way. So it used to be the case that, for example, bankers would wear ties. If you were seen. Now you don't wear a tie. It's really interesting, these sort of cultural assumptions that we make about people. By the way, there's some historical stuff in here as well. We talk in the book about the tradition of calling males teachers sir and females miss, right? Now this goes back a long time. And we actually challenge that. We say, well, you can be called actually by your first name in the classroom. Because that is basically, if you think about it, it's quite sexist, those sort of norms. But as long as you keep the authority, and it's an authentic authority with your children or your young people, I think you can challenge some of those slightly rigid Victorian norms. And there are many, by the way, Victorian norms that we still adhere to in the school system. So one of the things I'd love to do, because that book's quite short. We wanted that book to be something that a trainee teacher could dip into, a trust leader could look at, right? So it's quite short, actually, if you look at it. I think over the next, it's probably going to take a few years. I'd love to crystallize some of these details, right? So we can actually provide more practical help for teachers. Because one of the things I fear is that particularly those going into the profession, at the moment, we're in this bizarre situation where, as I said, we've gone to that sort of Govian extreme of saying poverty isn't an excuse. Now, of course, I would agree that we want high expectations for all our children, irrespective of their backgrounds. And one of the reasons why I use that term, under-resourced backgrounds. At the same time, we've got to, acknowledge the reality of inequality outside those school gates. At the moment, we have a training regime for teachers where we hardly mention the word disadvantage. So many teachers come into the profession without hardly any grounding on the fact that many of their children in their classroom will be struggling with profound issues outside the classroom. It just seems madness to me. So I do initial sessions with many trainees, And I think we should have a national module on this. I mean, it astounds me that we are sending teachers into the classroom without any grounding on, one, a knowledge of those inequalities, and two, a sense of some of the things that I'm talking about. That there are biases you need to be aware of, that children, that you need to think about the backgrounds of your children. The idea that poverty is almost should be ignored, I think, makes no sense to me. So I think these are things that are really profoundly important.
And Maxine there just echoing, just saying, really good point, seeing this a lot with ECTs, sort of following on from your points there. I find it interesting, but I think schools, I would add to that, schools I think have a part to play. And, I know a lot of teachers who maybe haven't walked around the block outside their school or haven't, really been outside the school gates to see what is the other side of the fence. And we do run into a risk there, I think, of maybe making assumptions about what is coming through the gates and how our young people are living outside of the walls of the classroom. I want to get into kind of the some the practical, the tips, the things to take away. We're going to pop to the news, and if you're with us, have those questions in mind. You can start typing them now, and Lee, we will get into the nitty gritty of that on just the other side of this. Okay,
great.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
School summer holidays are often a hot topic, but they made the news again in The Guardian as leaders in Wales appear to be considering changes. According to reports, Wales's Minority Labour Administration wants to shrink summer breaks from 6 weeks to 5 and eventually reduce it to 4 weeks. The plan would see the time added to half-term breaks in October and May. The proposal would equalise the length of terms and break the connection with Easter by fixing the timing of the spring break regardless of when the religious festival falls. The newspaper says the plans follow research by the government which suggests that parents struggle to organise and pay for childcare over the summer. Plaid Cymru, which supports the proposal, said in a statement that the current calendar was outdated as it was designed a long time ago, and that some families find the summer break very long and impacting negatively on their well-being. However, the article also points out that evidence of the harm to learning from school holidays is unclear, as much of the evidence comes from the United States, where summer holidays can be up to 12 weeks long rather than the 6 to 7 weeks in the UK. John Hattie, Professor of Education at the University of Melbourne, said the effects from school holidays are very small, and there is little reason to believe that the length of the school year has much effect at all. A study from 2019 that looked at pupils from primary schools in an area of high deprivation in Scotland and England found no effect on reading skills. In Northern Ireland, schools typically have 8 weeks off in the summer, but generally have results in exams that are better than those in England or Wales. However, a 2022 study did find evidence of worsening mental health in some age groups over long summer breaks. Surveys done in Wales found 60% of parents said they were quite happy with the school year as it is. In 2013, then Education Secretary Michael Gove gave schools in England the power to choose the timing of holidays, but most schools kept the 6 weeks. The BBC News website reports on the Beyond Ofsted inquiry. The inquiry is chaired by former Schools Minister Lord Knight and is funded by the National Education Union. The report from the inquiry recommends that schools should instead be responsible for their own improvement plans. Ofsted has responded by repeating its previous statement that inspections are needed to ensure a high-quality education. The inquiry said that Ofsted was now seen by many as toxic and not fit for purpose, and in need of major reform. The removal of single-word judgments was also recommended, and this echoed another report on school improvement released earlier by the Institute for Public Policy Research, which also called for narrative-style judgments rather than single words. The Beyond Ofsted inquiry recommended stopping Ofsted from having direct contact with schools, and instead schools should draw up their own improvement plans, which would make them accountable to parents and the wider local community. Lord Knight, speaking to the BBC, said Ofsted created a culture of fear in our schools. His report also said that Ofsted had become under-resourced for the high-stakes job expected of it. A spokesperson for Ofsted said 9 out of 10 schools say inspections help them to improve. In related news, the current Chief Inspector of Schools, Amanda Spielman, has written in her final annual report about parents being increasingly willing to challenge school rules in England. She described the unwritten contract between home and school as fractured and that it will take time to repair. The report is broadly positive, but draws attention to a shift in behaviour, attendance and attitudes to education since the pandemic, describing it as leaving a troublesome legacy. Full details of her comments can be found across media outlets. Teach First has celebrated its 20th anniversary, with 3 former Prime Ministers praising the charity's work in tackling education inequalities. According to Teach First's own website newsfeed, the charity has recruited more than 16,000 teachers to work in disadvantaged areas across England. Teach First CEO Russell Horby reaffirmed the charity's mission to help Britain's most disadvantaged children to achieve their full potential. Finally, student immigration data has been released, with Home Secretary James Cleverly stating the biggest drivers of immigration to the UK are students and healthcare workers. He further commented that this was testament to our world-leading university sector. According to data, Indian nationals account for over 1/4 of all sponsored study grants, followed by Chinese nationals. The education sector relies heavily on students applying to UK universities for significant funding. But there is also political pressure to reduce net immigration. Any plans to make changes to the current system will be monitored carefully, although for now the focus remains on illegal migration rather than legal routes. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Live from Swansea, this is the Twilight Show with Nathan Gynn on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Oradal Pau Croeso Abertawe. Hello everyone, welcome to Swansea and Teachers Talk Radio. On this Twilight Show, we are talking about equity in education with Lee Elliott Major, about the book Equity in Education, Levelling the Playing Field of Learning, and it is a practical guide for teachers, and that is where you find us at this point in the show if you are joining us live. If you are joining us live now, remember, you can find this as a podcast, as a download, iTunes, Amazon, and also you can ask your Alexa. I won't demonstrate that now, or my Alexa will start talking. You can find all of our previous shows at ttradio.org, where there is a little search bar. So you could type in equity into that and it will pull up all of our shows that have that topic in the description. Welcome back, Lee.
Hi, good to be back.
And so I did say, you know, we're going to try and get into some of the practical tips. Maxine has sent in a question. I think this is going to be part of the second stage of this, Maxine, because I want to focus on teachers first of all. But she's asking the question. She says, really interested in this aspiration yet appreciating the barriers faced discussion. What advice would you give around this? Well, we're in an advice section, Maxine, and we'll kind of try and pinpoint that question for you as we go through. But I wanted to ask you first, Lee, this is from a kind of individual teacher's point of view, and this is around, there is a quote in the book from Dylan William that says, the hardest thing you can do as a teacher is teach someone not like you. I should also say Dylan William on the front cover here of the book, comprehensive and groundbreaking, he calls it, which, you know, I would agree with entirely with him. Again, on another thing. Most teachers, we've said, are from broadly middle class backgrounds, or at least now living middle class lives as teachers. And you've mentioned before the news there that they receive little or no preparation in how they might understand under-resourced and working class pupils, or disadvantaged, or whichever blunt tool their school is using, PP, free school meals, to define the young people that we're talking about. But what can the teachers themselves do then to help start addressing this?
So we do start to talk about this in the book, and as I said earlier, I do feel like I'm on a bit of a journey with this, because I think some of the advice we give is quite broad, actually, and some of the sessions I've been having with teachers, we started to get into the nitty gritty a bit more, which I'll come to. But in the book, we just, one of the things, an obvious thing, is that I feel that groups of teachers should reflect on the social biases that the research shows that exist in the classroom. And one simple way of doing that is comparing your judgments as a teacher with some form of formative, test or assessment you can do. You probably want to do that as school-wide, actually. And some of the schools I've worked with, it's always really interesting when you see the results, right? And often they will replicate that more generic result that, those children from under-resourced backgrounds tend to be judged as having lower achievement than the test would suggest. I think alongside that, and you mentioned it earlier, I do think, and I'm really conscious with all this stuff, that teachers are up against it in the workload. So, one of the questions I often get asked is, Lee, what do you have to stop doing to do all this? I do think there are some things you probably should think about prioritizing, I guess. But it's knowing those children's background. So those biases that we document in the research literature, it's, I talk about working class backgrounds. There's a number of characteristics associated with underrating. We're a research project right now on this, actually. And so we find that children, for example, summer-born children, I'm a summer-born child, tend to be underrated compared to their actual. We think, anyway, that teachers misconstrue immaturity for lack of achievement, actually. So again, be aware of your summer-born children in the class, particularly in the primary school years. Those children that have some behaviour or conduct problems, again, tend to be underrated because, again, you're confusing perhaps behaviour with actual achievement. And some of the reflections I've had from individual teachers since giving the talks, interestingly, are about some of the more, I guess, strict behaviour rules that we now have in schools, and a reflection that actually the way that different children respond to this can be informed by their backgrounds. And so I think we just need to be a bit sensitive to that. So some teachers, one session I did, they were saying they felt that those children from particular working class backgrounds tended to close down very quickly when they were being reprimanded in a certain way, whereas those from more middle class backgrounds were able to advocate themselves, engage in a way that sort of enabled them to sort of still progress, right? So I just think we need to think through some of the policies that we now see in the system in terms of the different backgrounds. The other thing we find is those children who have parents without degrees tend to be underrated compared to those with parents who are graduates. So I think for me, there's sort of understanding the class a bit more. So it's not just PP versus non-PP. The other thing, by the way, we ask in our survey of for this study whether teachers think the parents are interested in school or not. And you find, again, a very strong association with those children that the teachers think have parents who are not interested in school. They tend to underrate those children. So I think there's something about just having a deeper understanding about the backgrounds of your children. And we explore in the book things like home visits. I mean, again, you have to be really careful with these and who you do that with, because you can't do it for everyone. But there's some lovely tricks I've seen in the system where, when a child, for example, joins secondary school, you do a home visit and you actually give the parents a choice of various classes. So one could be, I know, an introduction to the school. You give, and you do it in a way that suggests they got to do something. And this is a way of engaging with the parents, by the way. And so for an individual teacher, of course, you do that parent-teacher meeting, right? I think we should change the way we use those meetings. At the moment, I have to say, as someone who's been through them, I'm a father. My children are quite grown up now. They're not particularly useful, I have to tell you. And teachers, again, don't get much training in how to work with parents. I think we should flip those sessions that we have and think about how can we help the parents help their children in some very focused, targeted ways. So that's something I think we should explore some of those things. So there's lots of things I think a teacher can do at the classroom level. And as I said, I'm getting some really interesting feedback from teachers. So a lot of them talk about language, funny enough, and the fact that they have changed their accents to be that sort of accent that they think they should have as a teacher, interestingly enough, and the language they use in the classroom, and indeed just celebrating working class achievements. So I list in the book many of the amazing things actually that working class people have contributed to British and other cultures. We just don't do enough, in my view, to explain to all of our pupils that some of these people came from backgrounds that were similar to theirs, right? There tends to be this assumption that everyone is a success. And I know I'm probably exaggerating a little here, but it tends to be loaded with those sort of middle class assumptions. And listening to your news bulletin, it's sort of, it's really interesting to me because most of the people in charge of the policies are quintessentially middle class people, right, who come from middle class backgrounds. So there's all sorts of loaded assumptions about how we do Ofsted inspections, for example. How we rate schools. And one of the problems we have with low social mobility in this country is most of the people that shape the policies in education come from very middle class backgrounds. And I find it quite patronizing, I have to say, some of the things that are said about our education system from, and I'm not going to name any names, but there is that assumption at the heart of those people at the top of the education system, in my view. And I suppose Michael Gove would really embody that idea, but I think we need to change it. If we don't change it, I can guarantee you this, we'll be having another radio show in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, and the disadvantaged or the under-resourced will still be deemed failures, in my view, unless we change some of these fundamentals. I'm sorry, but I see it as stark as that. So that's where I stand on things. But individual teachers can do things. But I think what I'd love to do is work with teachers over the coming months and year to really maybe crystallize some of those things so we can guide those in the early years or the primary school years or those in secondary schools and beyond, with some really practical things. But those are some of the things we suggest in the book.
No, I find it really interesting, and I find some of the things that you described there is, as I think you said, really on in the show about actually this kind of approach of treating people as individuals, and that some of this stuff actually, whatever the barrier, actually a lot of this stuff could apply in different ways to whatever the barrier, whether it being that they are under-resourced or it coming from another area through treating them as individuals. I wanted to focus in on something there you said, and I had actually during the news had your book open at the working class assets page, and as I was just kind of flicking through and listening to the news, and there is a thing that worries me slightly about it, and that is I'm trying to think how to achieve some of that appreciation I guess, some of that cultural capital that can come from any class, but without it being maybe pastiche, without it being cringy. Does that make sense? Without it being bolt on. Yeah, or is it a matter of just kind of highlighting some of these people, like you say, David Hockney, Tracy Emin? I guess my question is how do cringy is the word I'm going to use. How do we do it without it seeming inauthentic? Authentic. There we go. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest, when I wrote some of that stuff, it was really, here's a taste of what it could be like. But even when I wrote that, I was worried that it could look a bit tokenistic, right? Here's a few working class oiks that have done well. Let's just add them on. You're absolutely right. It has to be done in an authentic way. But I talk about Dickens in there. A lot of the books have that social class divide as part of the theme. There's many characters in Dickens models that are social climbers, and actually there's lots of interesting characters that realise that the world isn't just about social climbing. There's some really interesting stuff in Dickens about people who realise that it's not all about social climbing, and then you do lose stuff if you become part of that in that era, more middle class. So I think it has to be done in an authentic way. You're absolutely right. I think the other thing I would say is what we try to do in the book is be intersectional in our and how we define what we call working class, and that means it can be those also who happen to be female or happen to be black or whatever. So I do worry about the sort of some of the media debates about white working class boys specifically, because it feels like it's putting that one group against other groups who are also marginalized. So I think we have to think about it in an inclusive way. But things like, I did physics. I did a physics degree. Faraday is one of the greatest physicists we've ever produced, came from incredibly sort of humble background. I think it is worth mentioning it, but doing it in a very careful, sensitive, and authentic way. So we talk about a lot of people there, but those are sort of examples. I think there's also bits of the curriculum already where you could just introduce this. It's not necessarily adding it on, but I do know what you mean about this, because I think there's a sort of slight cringe. I think that's probably the right word, actually. And I think we're all, particularly in Britain, we're all really sensitive about this stuff, right? We're all class conscious still. So I think it is doing it in a way that's not patronising. But I'm absolutely convinced you have to do this, because there are many pupils in your class who, if you're in a school that is genuinely comprehensive, right, who will come from different cultures. And by the way, I'm focusing here on social class. I think it's also thinking about other cultures as well. No, I think there are ways of doing it, but I totally get your challenge about doing this on post. By the way, I have a real rant about, I'm not sure if it got into the book in the end, but about, I'm a musician as well, but I'm sort of, into more sort of 1980s type, late 70s, early 80s. But 1990s, I don't know if you remember that, but we had this sort of Britpop sort of flowering of British music. And I always have this debate about, I think, and you're like this actually with your Welsh heritage, I think the Manic Street Preachers song, Designed for Life, is a great song in that it celebrates working class culture in a way that talks about intellectualism. It talks about libraries. Often when we see the caricatures of working classness by bands like Blur, nothing against Blur, but if you look at some of their songs in those 90s, it is a bit of an appropriation of working classness. It's a bit of a sort of a caricature. Whereas the Welsh boys, I just think, yes, that's authentic. And it actually, working class culture is intellectual. Let's not forget that, right? So So anyway, sorry a bit of a rant
Yeah,
on that, but
no,
I think you've got to get it right, and you've got to have authenticity. I totally agree.
I entirely get what you mean on that, and I will say, I imagine, having not been, but I imagine that in parts of northern England, but certainly in Wales, and I know my uncle goes up to the Durham Miners Gala, but certainly. Um, Union libraries, miners' libraries, and things like that, and intellectualism around poetry and art from a working class roots is something that possibly I can see in the past. I maybe can't see sort of pulled through, and at some point that got lost. Maybe around the 80s, I think 90s. There was maybe a gap of some sort, maybe in my knowledge of it, but certainly, yeah, what it takes to be, an intellectual, but from a working class background, I guess, and certainly that does appear strongly in the Welsh culture, I think.
It does, and it's very, very much absent. I mean, I haven't thought about this, though, to be honest, but if you think about English public debates, there's so few working class public intellectuals, particularly, I have to say, from a more left side of the debate. There's so few. You think about, I mean, if we watch Question Time, you think about who gets on Question Time. I can't remember the last time. Maybe listeners can remember, but it just seems such a middle class thing. And by the way, those debates, I would say those panel debates are themselves a sort of middle class thing. And, I would add, by the way, just in the workplace, the interview is a quintessential middle class selection tool. Again, I generalize and stereotype to be provocative here, but those children that have been speaking at the dinner table all their lives and been taught how to advocate for themselves, speak over lunch or dinner, and all that stuff, you're going to just be more comfortable when you're up against three people looking at them interviewing you. And what's really frustrating is often the interview is testing you for skills that you don't need a performance for, right? So it's usually another job that isn't about being in front of three people in an intimidating space, but we use the interview as a selection tool. The conspiratorial side of social mobility researchers would say it's all set up to retain the social elites. I suppose I'm less conspiratorial, although I think the system is failing. But some people would argue we've actually created a system that is designed to perpetuate the elites. And so that's possibly the bigger picture here. It's so difficult to unlock a system, to address a system which has been geared to essentially perpetuate the same people in charge from generation to generation. Anyway, I'll stop talking there.
No, yeah, as you say, like I find it incredibly interesting, and we could probably go well over the hour and a half, but I want to get focused back just in a little bit, we've talked about individual teachers there. I wanted to ask about school leaders and sort of the setup of schools, and whether there are things that present themselves as a barrier that we are doing ourselves. I guess possibly in the way we structure what we're looking at, whether it's that we're asking for data where it's PP versus non-PP, or whether it's the kind of curriculum or assessment structures that we're choosing as leaders and middle leaders. Are there things, there are in the book, I should say, but what would be things you pull out there for people to reflect on?
So again, I've been speaking with teacher leaders and getting some really good responses on this and some reflections. I mean, one of the things that's very simple is that equity, let's call it equity or capacity mindset, should be front and center of every conversation you have as a school leader. I think it's so central, this. So you are asking, in terms of what is the consistency of individualized feedback in our classrooms? Is there a systematic bias in our schools or our school? I think you can really ask those questions, and I think you can do some very simple exercises, as I said, comparing perhaps assessments with teacher judgments, and just doing that again. You've got to frame that in a very, I think, non-threatening way, so that it's not, you're not going to sort of sack anyone if their judgments are seen to be so out of line with the assessments. But I think as an exercise, as a very constructive, positive exercise in let's try and improve some of the interactions in our classrooms, if we can find, if there is these biases in our own schools, which I suspect there will be. I think for leaders as well, we talk a lot in the book about this. I think there is this developing authentic relationships with parents and communities. And there's some schools that, by the way, you know, a lot of these things, a lot of secrets are in the system. I always say this. So a lot of the things we say in the book, of course, we review hundreds of research studies from across the world and all that. But a lot of it, to be honest, was me presenting to teachers over years and spotting some really good practice. And so there usually is a teacher or a school doing something incredibly well somewhere. And so we cite some of those examples of working with parents more closely. And it's really difficult, but, you know, I think part of this, you mentioned that word authenticity, it is trying to, for example, have low stakes meetings with parents. So they come to their parents, you know, and I talk as one, my kids are now just out of school. But I think this is part of the function of the system that schools are under so much pressure. But as a parent, a lot of the information you get tends to be very much around, you know, the performance that in a very narrow way of your child, or if there's something wrong, you know. I think it's probably because schools don't have enough time, probably, but there needs to be just more basic relationship building with parents. And I think with some parents who themselves have had a very negative experience of education that stays with them, by the way, you talk to your friends about experiences of school, honestly, they will stay with you for life. If you have a negative experience in the classroom, it makes you feel very intimidated when you walk into that school. All the memories come back. So there's some really interesting things I've seen in Scandinavia where you have neutral locations for a celebration of not just academic things, but other things. You know, there's been some lovely things I've seen around music or food, you know, celebrating different cultures. And so I think we can work harder at all that. I mean, the pushback I get on this sometimes, Lee, we've only got so much time, you know, and I get that. But I think if you could enable some of your children to be more school ready, honestly, the benefits would be huge. One of the statistics we quote in the book is that at least half the variation in outcomes of children is due to outside school factors, not inside school factors. So if you were able to provide free breakfast, if you were able to provide eyesight tests, or at least refer children to somewhere that can do those, dental checks or what have you, then I think the benefits for learning are huge. I think the balance for a school leader is how do you do all this and then ensure that the teaching is consistent and that you're recruiting enough teachers, etc. So I totally get that. But I think there's lots of things that we suggest leaders can do on this. But as I said, this is very much a journey for me. And I'm finding every time I give a talk, there is another suggestion, which is great. And that's something I want to start collecting and compiling so that eventually, you know, we'll have some really practical ideas for teachers to consider.
I'm going to pitch you my suggestion on that now. And this is something that I currently do. You know, I work in a challenging social, economic, under-resourced catchment. I think they've just done a study, and the catchment for my school is I think definitely in the top 5 out of I think 2,000 in Wales for things like social connectedness. And in the multiple disadvantages, factors of deprivation thing. I can't remember the exact wording of the study. So we struggle with that. But I have broadly done away with the classroom app-based communication, and I have got myself a very old mobile phone, and I just WhatsApp parents. And do you know what? That really works. And I don't know what it is. And I have no idea. I think maybe it's the authenticity, maybe it's more natural to people, or maybe it's that classroom apps are and telephoning the attendance hotline to leave a message when you can WhatsApp someone is like is a middle class thing to do. I don't know, but I will throw that out there. That is my suggestion to people: is if you're struggling communicating, why not communicate in the way that most people do, which is the natural way of doing things, which is a text message or a WhatsApp, not phoning a hotline to leave an answer phone message, which I don't think anyone does know anyway. So that's my suggestion for you there.
Yeah, I think see someone like Nathan, like you, who's kind of experienced, and you've seen. What I would like to see is, because teachers coming into the profession, as I said, one, they don't get any training around understanding disadvantage and us preparing them for that. In one of my articles, I sort of prepared it it's sort of, maybe it's a bit of a crass metaphor, but it's like, the First World War, sending people over the trenches to, with no preparation. It's like, it feels a bit like that too. But I feel like those practical tips from teachers who are experienced, for those that are going into this anew, who a lot of teachers are very nervous about interacting with parents, particularly, to be frank, those parents. It's really interesting. What the studies show is there's a lot of parents that just don't interact at all. So there's the sort of missing middle, if you like. And then there's a very sort of challenging group who are challenging the whole nature of our schools, actually. And actually, one of the reasons I think that's happening is because of all the things I'm talking about. I just don't think the curriculum and the way the schools are set up is actually fulfilling many expectations on what school's about. So there's a group and then of course there's the very sharp-elbowed middle class parents who want the best for their children. It's really difficult to teachers. I think we need much more of a grounding for teachers in how do you navigate that. So that's something we could do more on. Absolutely. But it's little tips like that can make all the difference. It has to be authentic. Yeah.
But while we're talking about parents, then, and I wanted to ask this, and we are coming to the end. It's a really tough one, but some people would say, where this balance of, I often see like these cartoons shared where it's like in the 60s, the parent was shouting at the kid and with the teacher next to them, and now it's the parents shouting at the teachers as well, or like whose responsibility it is. Does that need to change? Is that a perception thing of teachers who blame the parents, or society blames the parents, or is that another one of these false dichotomies that they're falling into?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen those sort of cartoons as well. I actually think that the system itself needs changing. I would argue, and again, this might not everyone agrees with this. I think that curriculum needs looking at. We fail a lot of children. The system fails a lot of children as it is at the moment. I think the Govian experiment has not worked out. The idea that every child should do 8 subjects, that school should be measured on progress 8, all this stuff, it hasn't worked out. And I think we need a more realistic system. And I think many children and their parents are put off by a system that is so loaded with middle class assumptions that I can kind of, on some levels, understand why they're rejecting it. And I think teachers are doing the best they can in many ways, right? And so for me, it's more systematic, actually. But if you had a system that was catering to all our children in an inclusive way, I think teachers would have more of a chance of creating authentic relationships. I think you can have authority and authenticity at the same time. I think it's a real skill, and the teachers that do it and have it I always think are amazing. Teaching is, in my view, one of the most complex, challenging human tasks we know, right? Honestly. And we talk a bit about that in the book. And so don't underestimate. One of the problems with teaching, I think, is that a lot of parents think they can know how to do it. A lot of people sort of naively think it's easy. It's not. It's not. So, I think the system needs changing. And at the moment, I am very much trying to influence some of the key policymakers to look at things like Ofsted, which affects all schools in England, to look at performance tables, because these are things that really set the tone. If we don't change the system, honestly, I think we will see stark achievement gaps, if we want to frame it in that way, for years to come. And I think we will see a crisis in teacher retention. So we have to do something.
And, a brilliant kind of message of, of hope, of urgency for us to kind of end the show on. I will just say to, the listeners that, this is the book, A Practical Guide for Teachers, Equity in Education, Leveling the Playing Field for Learning. I bought an extra copy, is all I'm saying to you listeners, so that I can hand it out. And I think you're right. This isn't just a book for maybe teachers like me who are, maybe feel like they know that they're in an area of social deprivation. But, I recognize this from teaching in other schools that this is something that affects across the board. And in all schools, I think there's things in this that teachers and leaders could look at and reflect on what they are doing within their own schools, no matter where you feel your school is on that spectrum.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a real pleasure. I hope I've inspired and people rather than depress them on this, because I do think it's difficult, this. But, if it was easy, we would have solved it by now. I do urge people to go out and get the book, because there is a lot of detail and nuance in it. And I'm looking forward very much to all the talks I'm doing over the next 6 months, at least, to trusts around the country, and indeed in other countries. It's been great. So I'm so pleased that it struck a chord with everyone. I just hope it leads to better outcomes for all those children we all want to serve.
No, thank you so much for giving up your time to join us. If you are listening live, don't forget, over on Twitter/X, as it's now called, we're just about to start the debate on Education Tonight, where you can join us over in a Twitter space, or X space as they're now called. Thank you again to Lee, and we will see you all next time from here in South Wales. Nostar, and good night. Thank you again, Lee.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.